The Sahara Depression is a place in western Egypt, 426 feet below sea level, with brutal conditions. Temperatures reach up to 122 degrees Fahrenheit, zero rainfall. But Egypt has decided to turn it into a sea. Yeah, that sounds insane. Its area is supposed to reach a massive 5,400 square miles. To put that in perspective, that's almost the size of Lake Ontario, one of the biggest lakes in North America. The photos will be breathtaking, no doubt, and tourists will swarm there like moths to a flame. But that's not even the main point. With this sea in the middle of the desert, Egypt plans to address a bunch of the problems that both the continent and the country are facing right now. Generating a huge amount of energy, creating a giant natural battery, and much more will become possible thanks to this new body of water. It seems we're close to something revolutionary on the African continent. Today, we'll take a look at what exactly Egypt has in mind. Sea in the desert. When Europeans first mapped out Sahara, they didn't see it as a patch of useless desert, but as an empty basin just waiting to be filled. That's how an idea was born, one that still sounds a bit insane today, to create a real sea in the Sahara. The idea first came about back in the 19th century, when engineers were more like dreamers in hard hats. It was proposed to flood part of the Sahara to create a so-called inland sea. People were convinced it would change the climate, bring rain to the region, and make it possible to grow crops where now there's nothing but dunes. For Europe of that time, projects like these sounded like pure magic, as if humankind had finally learned to rewrite the laws of nature. But after the first calculations, it became clear the cost of digging a canal from the Mediterranean to the basin was astronomical. Even the wealthy colonial powers didn't dare spend that kind of money on such a risky experiment. After World War II, the world began to believe that technology could do anything. Turn rivers around, raise land, or even flood a desert if one wished. In the 1950s and 60s, the Egyptian government and foreign engineers really did consider building this major canal. But once again, problems came up. The area where the work had to be done was literally riddled with World War II mines. Hundreds of thousands of unexploded shells remained under the sand after the battles at El Alamein. Even scouting the area was dangerous, not to mention large-scale earthworks. Don't forget about the climate, temperatures near 122 degrees Fahrenheit, loose soils, strong winds. All this made the project almost impossible, too risky and too expensive. In the mid-1970s, engineers from the US and Europe decided to look at the problem from a different angle. If you can't dig by hand, maybe you should blow it up. And they didn't want to use thousands of tons of explosives, but nuclear charges. The calculations were simply staggering. They needed 213 nuclear charges, each with a yield of 1.5 megatons. That's 100 times more than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The explosions would almost instantly carve out a trench tens of feet deep, along which the sea itself was meant to flow into the desert. The people behind this idea even said that such a method would be cheaper and faster than traditional excavators. On paper, it all looked almost like science fiction. Within a couple of weeks, the desert turns into a sea and new cities rise along its shores. But military experts were quick to point out the obvious. Nuclear explosions near the Mediterranean would mean a radioactive disaster for the entire region. The radioactive dust could settle not only in Egypt, but also in Israel, Libya, and even southern Europe. On top of that, no one could predict how the ground would behave. There was a real chance the channel would collapse or simply sink into the sand. But a new century has come, and new ideas have emerged about creating a massive sea in the Sahara Depression. This time, though, without nuclear blasts or other wild fantasies, there's a plan that's actually doable, and people are ready to bring it to life. Closer to reality. The first idea of modern times was simply to dig a canal. But the desert doesn't forgive that kind of intrusion. Sand swallows everything within days. Storms erase even concrete, and the heat evaporates water faster than it can flow. And let's not forget about the millions of unexploded mines. Clearing such a zone for a canal is like playing minesweeper at excavator speed. So the engineers decided, if you can't go over, go underneath. That's how the idea of building a tunnel was born. It'll run deep under the sands, where there's no wind, no sun, and no minefields. Down there, the water won't evaporate, and the desert surface will stay untouched. Only the entry and exit will need to be cleared of war remnants. The rest will be handled by machines. These days, engineers have machines that used to be only in their early stages of development. Massive tunnel boring machines can gnaw through the earth at speeds of dozens of feet per day. They drill through salt, chalk, and sand while at the same time reinforcing the tunnel walls behind them with concrete rings. And most importantly, these machines have already handled some mind-blowing challenges in desert areas. For example, Egypt built the Cairo Metro using tunnel boring machines that dug underground routes and soil very similar to that in the region of the future Sahara Sea. The country's also completed numerous projects under the Suez Canal with these machines, road and railway tunnels alike. Again, all in similar conditions. So Egypt clearly knows what it means to carve a path underground, which is why the tunnel no longer seems like science fiction, but an engineering project with clear figures. The distance from the sea to the depression is about 34 to 50 miles, depending on the chosen route. The Qattara Depression lies 426 feet below sea level, which means the water could flow in naturally without any pumps, simply under the pull of gravity. One end of the tunnel would be in the Mediterranean Sea, the other on the dry desert bottom. Open the gate, and water would begin to slowly fill the depression, forming a massive mirror-like lake in the middle of the Sahara. To prevent any accidental flooding in Egypt, the water level is supposed to stay about 197 feet below sea level. This would turn the depression into a stable inland body of water. Not too deep, but vast. Just imagine, if the Egyptians pull it off, there'll be a sea in the Sahara as big as Lake Ontario in North America. What used to be a dream is now something Egypt is actually planning and working on. Not just for the wow factor, but because the man-made Qattara Sea would bring tremendous advantages. A new era of energy. What do you think about the idea of making a sea that can produce thousands of megawatts of power? Sounds crazy, but that's exactly what the Egyptians have in mind. The water will flow through a tunnel, the very vein that will carry the country's new energy. It'll rush downward, spinning turbines that will produce electricity. The whole thing works on the same principle as a regular hydroelectric plant on a river, only instead of a dam, there's the desert itself. And the drop between the sea and the bottom of the basin is around 426 feet. To put that in perspective, it's like a river falling from a height greater than 2 Niagara Falls. That kind of difference in elevation will generate a massive amount of energy. The main advantage of the project lies in its continuity. Unlike rivers that either run low or overflow, here the flow can be fully controlled. Once the water reaches the basin, it'll start to evaporate actively due to the high temperature. That very evaporation will create a kind of natural pump. The sea level in Qattara will gradually drop, and the system will draw in a new portion of water from the Mediterranean. It turns into a sort of endless cycle. The water flows in, generates energy, evaporates, and then comes another wave. Energy experts call it a gravity system with a constant inflow. But simply put, it's a giant natural turbine. It runs without oil, coal, or smoke. The sun only gives it a boost. The hotter it gets, the more water evaporates and the stronger the flow becomes. There are plans to build several hydro hubs, powerful stations where the water flow will pass through turbines and generators. In total, we're talking about 600 to 1,200 megawatts of power with an annual output of 4 to 7 billion kilowatt hours. That's enough to keep the lights on and washing machines running in several cities at once. But that's not all. As strange as it may sound, Egypt plans to turn the new artificial sea into a battery. The plan includes building a reservoir located higher than the future water basin. It'll be connected to the depression, creating a giant energy storage system. During the day, when the solar plants are working at full capacity, the excess energy will go to pumps that move water from the Qattara to this upper reservoir. At night, when the country consumes more electricity, the system reverses. Water from the upper reservoir flows back down, passes through turbines, and generates energy. This way, the basin and the upper reservoir will work together. This kind of water battery can even out peaks and dips, keeping the grid stable even when the sun goes down or the wind dies, and the panels and turbines stop producing. According to engineers' calculations, with a drop of over 300 feet and the volumes of water in question, the storage potential will reach millions of kilowatt hours. Not just energy. When the Egyptians started talking about creating a sea in the Qattara Depression, many thought it was all about turbines and energy, just another project for profit. But if you dig a little deeper, it becomes clear this isn't just about electricity, it's a whole attempt to change life in the heart of the desert. Something like a second Nile, only salty and out west. Yes, water dropping hundreds of feet will spin giant turbines. And Egypt plans to use that electricity for what it needs most right now, water. Not the salty kind, but the drinking kind. The hydroelectric plant in the basin will become the engine for desalination plants, which will pump salty seawater and turn it into life. Literally. What once required fuel will now be powered by wind and sea, clean energy born from the desert itself. There are even estimates. If all the potential energy from Qatar were directed to desalination plants, it could produce 396 billion gallons of fresh water a year. Of course, that's still far from the Nile. The country's main artery gives 14.6 trillion gallons per year, but even this amount could nourish huge fields of wheat and rice and simply provide countless people with an essential resource. It could be sent to arid regions, revive old farms, irrigate new lands. If all goes according to plan, Egypt could, for the first time, not just survive in the desert, but actually make use of it. Where clay cracks today, there could be fields, orchards, and in some places even vineyards. Ironically, it's the artificial sea that might bring life back to a land that thousands of years ago was itself a seabed. Scientists were already writing about this back in the mid-20th century. If a large area is covered with water, the air becomes more humid. The heat eases up and dust storms weaken. At night, there won't be such sharp temperature swings, and greenbelts could appear along the shores. Some places will have trees, other places shrubs. Where there's only sand now, something like new oasis could form. The new sea would bring everything else along. People will come to where there's water. Roads, settlements, farms, cafes, piers, all the things that go along with life by the water will appear. Today, the basin is a kingdom of sand, but imagine a coastline over 124 miles long. Yachts, beaches, fishing villages, a totally different scene. And the tourists will come too. Egypt basically lives off them. But all the roads lead to Giza, Sinai, or the Red Sea. Now imagine a new coastline right in the middle of the Sahara. Hundreds of miles of new beaches, resorts, fishing, walks along green shores. This isn't just scenery, it's an economy. The desert will turn into a place people can actually visit, whereas before everyone knew it was better to avoid the Sahara. Fish farming will become quite possible too. In brackish water, you can raise species adapted to it. This will provide food, jobs, and exports. What's empty and dead today could feed thousands of families. And at the same time, it's a chance to spread out the population. Egypt is incredibly crowded along the Nile, and any new livable territory becomes worth its weight in gold. Qatar could become not just a geographical spot, but a whole new region where real desert colonization begins. There's another unexpected effect. If the Mediterranean Sea slowly drains into the depression, some of its pressure on the Nile Delta could ease. That means the coastal lands where millions of Egyptians grow wheat and rice would suffer a bit less from rising sea levels. So the artificial sea doesn't just create new land, it also protects the old. Egypt isn't just building a sea, it's building a future where energy creates fresh water creates life, and life creates a new climate. And maybe, one day, gulls will really fly over Qatar. All for the sake of life. Even though the country needs a new sea for just about everything, this is anything but a simple project. A really difficult project, honestly, but there's no other option. Energy is a serious issue here. Egypt runs on electricity that literally depends on gas. 90% of the electricity comes from gas plants, and for now the country's engine still runs on this blue fuel. But local reserves are gradually depleting and demand is skyrocketing. Over the last 10 years, electricity usage has risen by almost 50%. And every summer when air conditioners buzz across Cairo, the power grid is pushed to the breaking point. Egypt has to import more and more gas to keep the lights on in its cities, and it's taken a serious toll on the budget. Actually, a huge toll. In 2023, 87.9% of the country's electricity came solely from fossil fuels. So that year, the country spent billions of dollars on fuel that burns in seconds. You can hardly call that sustainable. Gas is a tricky commodity. Prices fluctuate, deliveries depend on politics, and local production no longer meets domestic demand. That's why Qatar is more than just a bold construction project. It's a way out of the vicious cycle. The country needs energy that isn't tied to foreign tankers or the global market. Having a sea in the depression will allow the country to generate more energy without constantly worrying about running out of gas tomorrow. For Egypt, this isn't a matter of luxury, but a question of basic energy security. But the problem's much bigger and doesn't stop at kettles and air conditioners at home. When there isn't enough electricity, everything suffers, from factories to water pumps that bring fresh water to the farms. In a country where unbearable heat is normal, power outages are not just an inconvenience, but a disaster. People stock up on generators, hospitals run on diesel, and farmers lose crops because the pumps didn't turn on in time. It's all part of one chain. Gas gets more expensive, electricity becomes unstable, and the economy starts stalling like a car stuck in sand. That's why Egypt is now looking for any chance to create energy sources that don't depend on imports or politics. Wind, sun, and now even the sea in the desert. The Qatar project isn't just an engineering adventure, but an attempt to give the country its own reliable energy source. If the sea really appears, it could become a huge battery that won't fail, neither in summer nor in winter. And for Egypt, where stable electricity means stable life, this isn't a dream, it's a necessity. The desert is just a challenge. When we talk about Egypt, even a new sea in the desert doesn't seem that surprising. For Egyptians, sand isn't an obstacle, it's a playground for successful projects. In recent decades, Egypt has been literally rewriting the geography of the country, turning barren plains into fields, drilling wells deeper than ever, and building canals meant to give the country a second life. And it definitely makes you think that a sea in the Sahara could actually happen. Perhaps the most symbolic project was Sharq El Awanet. It emerged in the 1990s when the government decided the country could no longer rely solely on the river. In places where even caravans once wouldn't dare stop, hundreds of deep wells were drilled, some going 0.6 miles down. Through them, water is drawn from the Nubian sandstone aquifer, an ancient underground reservoir hundreds of thousands of years old. This water's like oil, only transparent. It's pumped with powerful machines pushed through pipes, and as a result, fields bloom in the dead sand. Today, more than 494,000 acres are under cultivation. Fields of wheat, corn, and potatoes stretch farther than the eye can see. On NASA satellite images, these plots look like green circles neatly arranged against the endless sandy sea. From above, it seems as if someone burned giant symbols into the sand. In reality, it's just Egyptian farmers proving that the Sahara can feed people, and it does. The harvest goes to the domestic market and partly to export. But if Sharq El Awanet is proof that you can conquer the desert, then Toshka is about claiming new territory. The project's even called the Second Nile. The idea is simple. Take water from Lake Nasser and channel it deep into the desert. They built a massive pumping station and then a network of canals that carry water almost 155 miles. The goal is to revitalize more than 1 million feddans. That is roughly 1 million acres of land. At first, people criticized the idea, too expensive, too hot, too far. But Egypt didn't back down. Tens of thousands of acres of farms are already up and running, and people are moving in. They grow not just wheat and corn, but also fruits, dates, and olives. The government's building roads, power grids, schools, and housing. Basically, a new province is taking shape in the middle of the desert. And what's especially important, it eases the pressure on the Nile Valley, where population density has long been off the charts. The scale of the project is enormous. Just building the pumping station in the first stages of the canal cost over 70 billion Egyptian pounds, or $1.5 billion. And the full program is planned to take decades. Every year, Toshka seems less like a utopia and more like a reality. For Egypt, this isn't just an agricultural project, it's a strategic reshaping of the entire country. And if Toshka is the heart of desert farming, then the New Valley project is the next chapter, only with an industrial focus. The plan is to build a whole network of agro-industrial complexes there. It won't just be fields, but also grain processing plants, storage hubs, and solar power stations. Egypt plans to invest more than $7 billion in this direction together with foreign investors, primarily China and the Gulf countries. The idea is to create new residential areas, jobs, and develop internal infrastructure, not just pump water around. Today, the project is already backed by new highways and power lines, and drilling of the first wells has already started in some areas. They plan to grow strategic crops here: wheat, corn, soybeans, sunflowers. Part of the harvest will be exported, and part will be used for the country's own food security. All of this is part of one big idea: to turn the desert from dead weight into a driver of growth. In a country where more than 90% of the land is sand, there's simply no other way. And Egypt is already proving that this path works. Just 20 years ago, skeptics said it was impossible to grow crops in the Sahara. And today, those same fields produce tens of thousands of tons of grain, fruits, and vegetables. Yes, it's not perfect. Underground water is running out. Some farms depend on subsidies, and the climate is unpredictable. But the fact remains, Egypt has learned to squeeze life out of the sand. And it's not just Egypt. Ambiguous help. On the border between Sudan and Ethiopia, among dusty hills, stands a massive concrete wall. This is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. For the locals, it's not just an engineering project, it's a symbol that their country is finally moving away from poverty and dependence. But for Egypt, it's a cause for concern. The Blue Nile, on which the dam stands, provides up to 85% of the water that flows through all of Egypt. It's this river that feeds the Great Nile, and without it, Egypt simply wouldn't exist. And now Ethiopia has built a structure that can decide how much water will flow downstream and how much will stay with them. If you look at the numbers, it's easy to see why Egypt is worried. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam reservoir holds about 19.5 trillion gallons of water, almost as much as the Aswan Reservoir, which Egypt spent decades building. While this massive lake fills up, the Nile's water level could drop noticeably. Even 1 inch less in the river means thousands of acres of dried up farmland. The dam itself is simply enormous. It's over 475 feet tall and almost 1.1 miles long. At the bottom sit 13 turbines, each generating about 375 megawatts. When they're all running, the dam produces 6.45 gigawatts. That's like 6 mid-sized nuclear power plants. Ethiopia proudly calls it the biggest hydro project in Africa and one of the most powerful in the world. For Ethiopia, this dam isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. For years, the country has suffered from power shortages, factories shut down, lights went out on schedule, and farming relied entirely on the whims of the weather. Now, things could be different. There'll be enough power not only for the country itself, but also for export. The government's already building transmission lines to Kenya and Sudan, planning to sell the surplus energy. This means that jobs will be created and the country will develop, something people here have dreamed of for decades. Egyptians, however, fear that when Ethiopia fills the reservoir, it'll trap too much water. The Nile could shrink farther downstream, and Egypt might face a real crisis. This isn't just a nuisance. About 95% of the country's drinking water comes from the Nile. And if the flow drops even by 10%, millions could be left without water, and harvests of rice, cotton, and wheat would fail. The main question is how fast Ethiopia will fill up its reservoir. Egypt insists on stretching the process out for many years so that the Nile doesn't run shallow. Ethiopia, on the other hand, wants to do it in 4 to 5 years, 7 at most, and that's where the sides clash. For Ethiopia, it's a matter of development. For Egypt, it's a matter of survival. The conflict has long gone beyond engineering. Over the past few years, the two countries have held dozens of negotiations, with Sudan, the African Union, and even the UN stepping in as mediators, but it hasn't helped much. Ethiopia believes it has the right to use its own river. After all, its sources are on Ethiopian territory. Egypt, meanwhile, refers to old agreements dating back to British colonial times that granted it priority access to the Nile's waters. Ethiopia refuses to recognize those deals, saying, "We never signed them." At times, the tension got so high that Egyptian media were talking about military measures. Of course, it didn't come to war, but nerves were on edge. Egypt's already feeling the effects. Water levels in its reservoirs are dropping, and farmers are complaining about reduced irrigation. And here's the thing, Ethiopia started filling the dam without fully coordinating with its neighbors, sparking protests and sharp statements from Cairo. But the response from Addis Ababa is simple. You've been using the Nile for 100 years. Now it's our turn. And if you think about it, you can understand both sides. Ethiopia wants electricity. Egypt wants water and stability. The problem is the Nile doesn't have any extra to spare. Any bucket held up upstream won't reach the delta, and no diplomacy can make the river flow faster. Knowing all this, Egypt is looking for ways to protect itself. Of course, nothing can replace the Nile, but at least the damage can be reduced. That's why in recent years, the idea of an artificial sea in the Qattara Depression has been coming up more often in Cairo. It won't solve all the problems, but it will provide energy that can be used for desalination plants. With these, Egypt can increase its fresh water supply without relying on the Nile at all.